Hello and welcome to the Central Television. I am Lekan Onabanjo. Here are the stories making headlines beyond the continent. We begin in U.S., where the U.S. Senate has approved a long-awaited $95 billion aid package for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan after months of political wrangling. While Democrats were in favor of passing the bill, Republicans were divided and previously voted it down. The package includes $60 billion for Kyiv, $14 billion for Israel's war against Hamas, and $10 billion for humanitarian aid in conflict zones, including Gaza. In the meantime, Ukraine's president said he is grateful to senators for passing it. Joe Biden has been urging Congress for months to hurry through the new aid to Ukraine and U.S. partners in the Indo-Pacific, including Taiwan. After Hamas's October 7 attack on Israel, the U.S. president also requested funds for the U.S. ally, along with humanitarian aid for Palestinians in Gaza.
Я дякую лідеру більшості в Сенаті Чаку Шумеру та лідеру республіканців Мітчу МакКоннеллу за рішучість та морально сильний вибір. Демократія точно вистоїть. Дякую кожному із 70 сенаторів, які проголосували позитивно. Україна дуже це цінує. Це був перший крок. Далі Палата представників, голосування конгресменів там. Очікуємо позитивного.
In the meantime, the U.S. government says it has seized a Boeing 747 cargo plane that officials say was previously sold by a sanctioned Iranian airline to a state-owned Venezuelan firm in violation of American export control laws. The Justice Department said the American-built plane had arrived in Florida and would be disposed of. Assistant Secretary of Export Enforcement Matthew Axelrod, in a statement, said following the deal, Argentina grounded the jumbo jet in July 2022. The U.S. Department of Justice announced late on Monday that it had taken custody of the aircraft after Argentina grounded it 18 months ago. Washington says that the sale of the plane to Venezuela in 2022 by Iran's Mahan Air violated its sanctions on Tehran. The United States says it is deeply concerned about the detention of a human rights activist in Venezuela. White House spokesman warns that the administration of President Joe Biden is watching the situation very closely. At a White House briefing, National Security Council spokesman John Kirby told newsmen that there are indications that Rocio San Miguel and perhaps one or two of her family members have been arrested.
We are aware of reports that Rocio San Miguel and I think a couple of members of her family now have been taken into custody. We're deeply concerned about that. This is a time when, as I have said before, Mr. Maduro needs to meet the commitments that he made back in the fall about how they're going to treat civil society, political activists, as well as opposition parties, and even those members of Venezuelan society that may want to run for office. They've got to meet those commitments. I won't go into speculating about what exactly happened here or what we might do as a result, but I can tell you we're watching this very, very closely, and we're deeply concerned by her arrest.
Thank you, Kareem.
We now take you to the Middle East, where U.S. President Joe Biden says civilians who are packed into Rafah in the Gaza Strip are exposed and vulnerable and must be protected. He also stated that Israel must make credible efforts to protect the more than 1 million Palestinians sheltering in the southern Gazan city. Rafah has come under heavy Israeli airstrikes in recent days, with several casualties reported. A Palestinian doctor told newsmen that people in Rafah were living in fear. This comes after last week, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced that he had ordered troops to prepare to expand its ground operation to Rafah. He vowed to defeat Hamas gunmen hiding in the city. Meanwhile, the United States says it is working on a hostage deal between Israel and Hamas, which would bring an immediate and sustained period of calm to Gaza for at least 6 weeks. U.S. President Joe Biden made this known during a joint press conference with Jordan's King Abdullah II at the White House.
As the King and I discussed today, the United States is working on a hostage deal between Israel and Hamas, which would bring immediate and sustained period of calm to Gaza for at least 6 weeks, which we could then take the time to build something more enduring. Over the past month, I've had calls with Prime Minister Netanyahu, as well as the leaders of Egypt and Qatar, to push.
Now, joining us to give more insights into this is our international correspondent, Afia Hagen. Now, Afia, what effect, if any, will Biden's call for a ceasefire have on the planned assault on Rafah by Israel?
That's a really good question. If a ceasefire was reached in the coming hours, so 48, 72 hours, it could prevent that assault on Rafah, which is something that the IDF have been gearing up for a number of days now. You've got about 2.3 million people packed into that coastal city of Rafah, usually 250,000. So an almost tenfold increase in the amount of people who are occupying that small coastal city. And the fears in that city are real. People are terrified. UN agencies saying that if this assault on Rafah goes ahead, then it will be absolutely catastrophic. Now, you saw Joe Biden there at the White House with the King of Jordan talking about a need to protect those civilians who are now sheltering in Rafah. You have had thousands, about 12,300 children killed already during this conflict in Gaza, never mind the older people, women, children, women and men also who have been killed, but 12,300 children. What really wants to happen is people want to prevent this death toll from going any higher. And like I said, unless a ceasefire is reached in the course of the next few days, the assault on Rafah will take place, and you could see up to 2.3 million people being at risk from bombardment from the IDF at this time.
So we are aware that about $14 billion is what the U.S. is hoping to vote to support Israel in its onslaught against Hamas. So could the tide now be turning, looking at America's attitude towards its support for Israel over this conflict?
When this conflict began, the US and other countries that consider themselves allies were very strong to say that Israel must do what it can to protect itself, to defend itself, to retaliate. Now, that rhetoric seems to have died down over the past weeks as the devastation in Gaza has been unfolding. So much so that you have a situation now where, like we said, we have Joe Biden talking about the people in Rafah, people in Palestine, saying that they have to be protected. I think that out and out support for Israel, which knew no bounds in the very beginning, is now being, it now has footnotes. It's now being punctuated with howevers. It's now about doing things within international law and making sure that civilians are protected. Now, from what we see coming out of Gaza and what we see coming out of cities like Rafah, Khan Yunis, is that civilians aren't being protected, that hospitals, that schools aren't being protected. And so the more evidence that comes, the more it's going to be difficult for countries like the United States to stand shoulder to shoulder with Israel if Israel is seen to be doing things that are not complying with international law. So I'm not sure if the tide is turning, but we are certainly seeing a change in rhetoric and a change in attitude towards Israel.
We'll come back to that in a bit, but then hostage remain captured by Hamas. What is being done now to secure their release?
Absolutely. Now, in numbers, you have 134 hostages that were abducted by Hamas on October 7th remain in Gaza. Not all of them are thought to be alive. You have 105 civilians who have been released by Hamas. That was during that week-long truce that managed to hold in the month of November last year. And 3 hostages, a couple of them actually just earlier on this week, have been rescued by the IDF. So you still have a good number of hostages that remain under Hamas control. Now, the problem with that is Hamas don't know where they all are. Some of them are with them, some of them are with sympathy groups like Hezbollah, like the Palestinian Liberation, who are also affiliated with Hamas and are also holding people hostage. So there's a question of Hamas don't actually know where all the hostages are to have them released. And some of them are dead. Unfortunately, they're not with us anymore. And so there is work being done to try and have these 105 hostages that are left, or 134 hostages that are left to be released. There's backdoor talks going on. If we manage to reach a ceasefire and have that 6-week ceasefire, you can almost guarantee that those 134 hostages will be released in that time. But these things are conditional. Without a ceasefire, we cannot expect any more hostages to be released. We can expect potentially some more rescue missions. The one that took place earlier on this week, which came after the bombardment of Khan Yunis. But it really all depends. If a ceasefire can be reached, then we will see more hostages being released.
Okay, let's quickly go back to the possibility of Israel complying with international laws. Obviously, it doesn't seem as though they will stop attacking Hamas, whether or not they're able to ratify the 6 weeks of ceasefire. Can Israel be sanctioned? Can they be made to face the consequences if they refuse to adhere to international laws? And who can make that happen?
That will be down to international courts and international jurisdiction. If you have enough countries coming forth to try and prosecute or push against Israel, like South Africa have done, to take them to the ICJ, if enough countries do that, then they can be prosecuted. But at the moment, you do not have enough countries trying to take Israel to the ICJ to make sure, or to have them prosecuted for breaking international law. And the problem with that is a lot of countries will see, if they try and push back against Israel, it could be seen as being anti-Semitic, rather than holding a country to account for what they are doing. So it is problematic, and unless more countries feel that they can take Israel to the ICJ, we won't see any more prosecutions of Israel for breaking international law at the moment.
Afe Hagen, thank you so much for talking to us. We now tell you that Israel's ambassador to the UN warns the mandate of an investigation into allegations that the United Nations staff participated in Hamas's unprecedented October 7 attacks is too vague, but says it will cooperate. Earlier this month, United Nations Chief Antonio Guterres announced the creation of an independent panel to assess UNRWA, the UN agency tasked with helping Palestinian refugees. The embattled agency had come under fire over accusations that 12 of its staff members were involved in the deadliest ever attack inside Israel on October 7 last year. The new independent panel, which will be led by former French Foreign Minister Catherine Colonna, is due to begin its 2-month investigation on Wednesday.
As it stands right now, is too wide. It's too wide. This is not a mandate that comes to check how to ensure you don't employ terrorists in the future, how to ensure you don't have infrastructure of hundreds of tunnels under UNRWA schools, under their main headquarters. This is how amazing it is. The mandate needs to be more concise. It needs to include experts that have the ability also to check counterterrorism and vetting procedures and how to make sure this does not happen. I have to say that Mr. Lazzarini answered saying several things about the investigation. As my foreign minister said, we plan to cooperate with the investigation that was established, the external investigation. That's one thing.
You're watching Beyond the Continent. We're not done with the stories yet. We'll be back in a bit. Many thanks for staying with us. Following talks with Palestinian Foreign Minister Riyad al-Malki in Berlin, Germany's Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock says Israel, like every other country in the world, has a duty to respect international humanitarian law. Israel has a duty to guarantee safe corridors for civilians in Rafah before conducting an incursion against Hamas in the southern Gaza city. Annalena Baerbock says hundreds of thousands of people had fled from the north of Gaza to Rafah on Israel's advice previously.
Diese Eltern, diese Kinder, diese Familien, sie können sich nicht einfach in Luft auflösen. Sie können nirgendwo sonst hin. Ganz sicher jedenfalls können sie nicht weiter nach Süden, denn dort ist ja bekanntermaßen die Grenze zu Ägypten. Schon geantwortet, Israel hat ein Recht, sich gegen den brutalen Terror der Hamas zu verteidigen, im Sinne des Selbstverteidigungsrechts wie jedes andere Land auf der Welt. Und Israel ist wie jedes andere Land auf der Welt in der Pflicht, das humanitäre Völkerrecht dabei zu achten. Das habe ich in den letzten 3 Monaten deutlich gemacht und das werde ich auch in den nächsten Tagen erneut deutlich machen.
Still in the region, Shahbaz Sharif, the president of the Pakistan Muslim League, Nawaz Party, at the news conference in Lahore, stated that his party will be very happy to sit in the opposition and play a constitutional role if the independent candidates are able to establish a government. In defiance of a crackdown that prevented them from campaigning, independent candidates loyal to imprisoned former Prime Leader Imran Khan won the most seats in last week's general election. Pakistan's political standoff after inconclusive elections last week showed no signs of ending on Tuesday, with the largest groups still unable to agree on forming a coalition government to run the crisis-hit country.
मेंबर जो अपने आप को पीटीआई स्पॉन्सर कहते हैं, बड़े शौक से हुकूमत बनाएं। हम अगर वो मेजॉरिटी दिखा देंगे, हम बड़े शौक से हम बैठेंगे ऑपोजिशन बेंचेस पे और अपना जो एक आईनी किरदार वो हम अदा करेंगे इंशाअल्लाह। We will have to go for another IMF package and without delay. I want to make it very clear whether it's a coalition or some other arrangement, whatever. It is the need of the hour that we have to go for IMF package. There is no escape, there is no alternative to it. माजी में भी इस तरह के concerns आते रहे हैं और मैं सिर्फ बहस बात नहीं करना चाहता। जो यहाँ पर observers मौजूद थे, फाफिन की किस हद तक का उसकी credibility है वो आप बेहतर जान सकते हैं। फाफिन के मुताबिक जिन हलकों पर ये ऑब्जर्वर्स गए, मेजॉरिटी वहां पर ये आजाद।
Let's now tell you that Felipe Lazzarini, head of the United Nations Agency for Aid for Palestinian Refugees, arrived for a meeting with UN ambassadors in Geneva on the situation in Gaza. Among those present are Israeli Ambassador Mirav Ilon Shahar, Palestinian Ambassador Ibrahim Kraishi, and French Ambassador Jerome Bonafont. Israel has called for UNRWA Chief Felipe Lazzarini to step down following claims that a Hamas tunnel had been discovered under its evacuated Gaza City headquarters. Lazzarini, who briefed member state representatives in Geneva on the situation, has stressed that his agency had not operated from the compound since October 12 and has said he has no intention to resign. We now take you to Europe, where Russian police have put Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas, Lithuania's culture minister, and members of the previous Latvian parliament on a wanted list. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said according to the Russian Interior Ministry's data, Kallas was wanted for the desecration of historical memory. Russian government said the Baltic officials were accused of destroying monuments to Soviet soldiers, acts that are punishable by a 5-year prison term under the Russian Criminal Code. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are all members of both the European Union and NATO, and their relations with Moscow have worsened sharply since the start of the war in Ukraine nearly 2 years ago. And away from that, the British Army loads hundreds of vehicles onto roll-on, roll-off transport ships as they head to take part in NATO's 75th anniversary exercise, Steadfast Defender 2024, which is taking place in Eastern Europe. 16,000 British Army soldiers with 600 vehicles are taking part in the exercise, which will last for 5 months. Former U.S. President Donald Trump recently said he would encourage Russia to attack NATO member states who didn't contribute 2% of gross domestic products to defense, calling into question the alliance's Article 5 Mutual Defense Pact.
First, to make those kinds of comments. And where the increases did come through in NATO, it was in years where strategic conditions and strategic drivers shifted. So Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, and then the invasion of Ukraine in 2022 was when we saw the biggest increase.
Let's now tell you that German Interior Minister Nancy Faeser said on Tuesday that the government would lower the hurdles for authorities to go after far-right financiers after revelations over a secret meeting of extremists triggered a wave of protest. A move is part of a package of measures aimed at strengthening Germany's hand in the fight against far-right extremism and reinforcing the country's institutions against attack. A January 10 report by the investigative outlet Corrective revealing that members of the far-right Alternative for Germany had discussed a mass deportation plan at a meeting with extremists caused widespread alarm. We now head to Asia, where Armenia says 4 soldiers have been killed and a 5th wounded in the first flare-up of violence on the border with Azerbaijan since the two neighbors began talks on a peace deal. Azerbaijan said it had destroyed an Armenian combat post in the south in retaliation for an earlier incident. Last year, Azerbaijan recaptured its Nagorno-Karabakh region held for decades by ethnic Armenians. Armenia has now accused its neighbor of trying to escalate tensions. The attack in Armenia's southeastern Sunik province also comes days after Azerbaijan's president Ilham Aliyev won a 5th term in office, and local commentators have raised concerns that he may be considering further military action to seize Armenian territory. And that's all at this hour. Don't forget to send your eyewitness report to the WhatsApp number and email on your screen. You can follow us on social media. We are at News Central TV. You can also watch News Central live on DSTV channel 422, Star Times channel 274, Avo TV, and YouTube. Many thanks for watching. I am Lekan Onabanjo.